Houston, we've had a problem.
Ignition flight.
We took off on April 11th, 1970 at 13:13 Central Standard Time.
Okay, Prado has it. Looks good here, flight. Good agree.
Hello, I'm Joe Whitty, and welcome to Disaster Chronicles. 13, for many, an unlucky number. For the American space program, Apollo 13 would bring new meaning to the term unlucky. After many successful missions, Apollo 13 would test everyone and everything associated with the space program. In less than a decade, the American manned space program had gone from playing catch-up with the Soviets to landing men on the moon. Alan Shepard made a suborbital flight lasting only 15 minutes, becoming the first American in space 3 weeks after the Soviets launched the first man in space. In early 1962, John Glenn was boosted into space and became the first American to orbit the Earth.
Roger, 0G, and I feel fine. Capsule is turning around. Oh, that view is tremendous. Roger.
The mission lasted 3 orbits. The Americans were testing systems that would advance technology in an effort to fulfill President Kennedy's challenge of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. The 2-man Gemini spacecraft made strides toward that goal, testing the skills and endurance of the astronauts by walking in space, tethered to their capsules. Ed White.
I feel like $1 million. I'm going to pick up.
Step up until left of 7.
Practice rendezvous and docking with other spacecraft.
Roger. We can very clearly see the horizon scanners operating.
Gemini 12, Gemini 12.
After 10 flights of Gemini, the Apollo program was underway, but tragedy struck early in the program. Gus Grissom, the second American in space, Ed White, the first American to walk in space, and Roger Chaffee, who would be going to space for the first time, the crew of Apollo 1. During routine training, a fire on the launch pad killed all 3 men. The Apollo program continued 16 months later with the launch of Apollo 7 atop the short-haul Saturn 1B rocket.
Apollo 7, Houston, we have you go for orbit. You're go for orbit.
Their Earth orbital mission tested new systems and would pave the way for later trips to the moon.
Apollo 8 coming to you live from the moon.
Apollo 8 circled the moon, but did not land on it.
Up here, the Earth from here is a grand oasis of the big vastness of space. We close with good night.
The crew of Apollo 8 sent back memorable pictures of Earth from a new, as yet unseen perspective.
All of you.
The Earth orbital mission of Apollo 9 would be the shakedown test of the Lunar Excursion Module, or LEM, the craft that would later land on the moon.
That's about all it looks like, though, some sort of machine.
The launch vehicle would be the same for the remaining Apollo missions. Atop the powerful Saturn V rocket, the command module, the crew cabin, the only part of the massive rocket that returns to the Earth in one piece. The service module, which houses equipment to supply electricity, water, and oxygen, as well as the main propulsion engine. The command and service modules remain connected until just before re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, when the service module is jettisoned. Below the service module, in the S4B stage, is the LEM, seen here with its legs folded. When the S4B stage is spent, the combined command service modules detach, turn around, and dock with the LEM, and continue on their journey to the moon.
Houston, Apollo 10, the Z-axis track now looks real good and real solid.
While in lunar orbit, Apollo 10 rehearsed procedures for the upcoming lunar landing mission, Apollo 11, July 20th, 1969.
30 feet, 2.5 down. Straight shadow. 4 forward. 4 forward, drift into the right a little. Contact light. Okay, engine stop.
Houston, Tranquility Base here. The Eagle has landed.
Roger, Tranquility. We copy you on the ground. You got a bunch of guys about to turn blue. We're breathing again. Thanks a lot.
Go ahead.
Roger, the EVA is progressing.
Neil Armstrong and Edwin Buzz Aldrin were the first 2 men on the moon. 12 more astronauts were scheduled to walk on the moon, but only 10 actually made it after Apollo 11. The astronauts of Apollo 13 did not walk on the moon. 42-year-old Navy Captain Jim Lovell, who had seen the moon close up on Apollo 8, was the commander. Lovell had also flown on 2 Gemini flights. It was the first mission for both the lunar module pilot Fred Hayes, a 36-year-old civilian test pilot, and command module pilot Jack Swigert, 38, a former Air Force test pilot. Swigert was the last-minute replacement for Ken Mattingly, who was scrubbed from the mission because he was exposed to German measles. Mattingly would watch from mission control.
Roger. That's just all engines. Roger. Okay, Fido, how's it look?
Looks good here, flight. Good agreement.
Okay, Booster, how do you look? That's what he looks good, flight. Okay, Capcom, we go you on the ground.
We'll go, flight. Looks good
It was
here.
an almost perfect launch. One of the 5 engines on the second stage cut off just before it was supposed to.
Flight Booster, the engine board out was way early. Okay.
But there was still enough power in the remaining engines to escape the Earth's gravitational pull and send them toward the moon.
All the other engines are go.
Odyssey, the command module, had already docked with Aquarius, the lunar module, a maneuver which was to become a lifesaver.
We're hard docked, Houston.
About 55 hours into the mission, 200,000 miles from Earth, the astronauts had just completed a TV transmission.
Hey, Houston, we've had a problem here.
Can say again, please. Houston, we've had a problem. Main B bus undervolt. Roger, main B undervolt. Stand by at 13, we're looking at it. We had a pretty large bang associated with the caution and warning there.
Flight, I've got a feeling we've lost 2 fuel cells. I hate to put it that way, but I don't know why we've lost them. It doesn't all tag up.
The scientists and technicians in mission control worked feverishly to find and solve the problem. The command module had lost precious liquid oxygen and hydrogen kept in cryotanks. The fuel cells convert the 2 gases into electricity and yield drinking water as a byproduct. Odyssey was running now on only 1 fuel cell. The only reserves on board were 1 small oxygen tank and 1 small battery to be used for re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. The tension in mission control, in the simulators, and around the world grew. Survival was all anyone could think about. Would the astronauts make it safely back to Earth? Would all the calculating, improvising, and prayers work? Apollo 13 was to become a test of modern science.
I'd say this is as serious a situation as we have ever had in manned spaceflight.
Ex Luna Scientia, knowledge from the moon. The crew of Apollo 13 gained a lot of knowledge, but not from the moon. Improvisation was the key to the safe return of Apollo 13. For 4 tense days, engineers and scientists worked around the clock trying to get the 3 astronauts home safely. There had never been a greater crisis in manned spaceflight. Years later, Jim Lovell, the commander of Apollo 13, described some of the details of what happened and some interesting coincidences.
Dan, we've got one more item for you when you get a chance. We'd like it to stir up your cryo tanks. Stand by.
And I heard a hissed bang. The spacecraft rocked back and forth. The jet started a fire to stabilize the spacecraft. I looked up at Fred, and Fred looked down at me, and I knew that Fred didn't know what caused this bang. Then I looked over at our 3rd companion, Jack Swigert. He was over there in the left seat, and his eyes were as wide as saucers.
Main bus A undervolt now, 2, Sean. Main A undervolt. And it looks to me, looking out the hatch, that we are venting something. We are venting something out into space. Roger, we copy your venting.
And it didn't take much intelligence on my part to realize that the gas escaping from the rear end and the needle on my second and last oxygen tank were one and the same. And very shortly, we'd be completely out of oxygen. And when that occurred, because we used oxygen to produce electricity in our fuel cells, the third fuel cell would die and we'd be completely out of electrical power. And when that occurred, because we gimbaled our maneuvering engine by means of electricity, we would lose our propulsion system. We were sort of in deep trouble.
So in space, it seemed like the command module was a time bomb waiting to go off. NASA officials say it was here the tanks exploded. A special test was conducted at the Cape, which showed some wires had overheated, leaving some bare spots. Later in flight, NASA thinks, these wires sparked. The spark traveled into a section of the service module where a tank insulated with plastic was located. Officials believe the mixture of overheated plastic and oxygen caught fire, causing an explosion, which blew off the side.
I'd say this is as serious a situation as we have ever had in manned spaceflight. We've always called the LEM a good lifeboat under those circumstances.
Had they not previously docked with the LEM, it could not have been used as a lifeboat.
We figure we've got about 15 minutes worth of power left in the command module, so we want you to start getting over in the LEM and getting some power on that.
They began powering up the LEM. It would be used as a lifeboat to tow the crippled spacecraft home, but using minimal power in order to sustain life. 3 lives hanging in the balance, dependent on the LEM for air, water, and electricity, dependent on its rocket engine and its navigational guidance platform.
I had to learn to fly all over again because with this big dead command module attached to me, if I pressed down on the attitude controller, the thing would go off in some wild gyration, so I had to learn where to go with the attitude controller to control the vehicle.
First, Apollo had to get into the correct lunar orbit, then use the momentum to slingshot back to Earth.
Aquarius, and you go for the burn.
40%.
Okay, Aquarius, you're looking good.
Auto shut down.
Right on the money, but still a long way from home, and not yet out of trouble. Apollo 13 swung around the backside of the moon, temporarily out of contact with the ground, 137 miles from the lunar surface. Not since the first moon landing had the space program captured so much public attention. All the world waited for the second crucial burn.
Jim, you go for the burn. Go for the burn.
Roger, understand. Go for the burn.
Guidance okay?
We're good, flight.
Control okay?
We're okay, flight.
Ground confirms ignition.
We lit the descent engine for the second time, left it on for 4.5 minutes, pushed us faster and faster and faster back home. And when it shut off, we turned off all those exotic equipments in the lunar module to save electrical power. The guidance system, the computer, the autopilot. The only thing we had working for us was a little fan to circulate the atmosphere and the radio to talk back home.
3 men traveling through the blackness of space. Cold, tired, too much time to think. The Apollo 13 astronauts thought they were on course and on their way home. But there were more problems ahead. The drama continued. Aquarius was an unlikely-looking lifeboat with an outside skin no thicker than several dozen layers of plastic kitchen wrap. A flying machine designed to keep 2 men alive for 45 hours. But now counted on to provide life support for 3 astronauts over a period twice as long. There were no seats in Aquarius, only standing room for 2 men, forcing the 3rd astronaut to always be in the dark command module. Thousands of people on the ground worked around the clock, tested ideas to stretch each watt of electricity, every drop of water. There was oxygen in the LEM to spare, but inside temperatures dropped to 35 degrees.
There was a sort of a chilling coldness. The walls were perspiring, the windows were completely wet, and it wasn't too healthy. I recall that we went in there to get some hot dogs one day, and it was like reaching into the freezer for the food.
They drank just 6 ounces of water a day, only 20% of normal intake. Lovell lost 14 pounds. No one had more than 12 hours of sleep in 3 days.
Hey, I want to say you guys are doing real good work. So are you guys, Jack.
Extensive plans had been drawn for possible rescue operations in 3 oceans. The Defense Department opted for the first choice, the mid-Pacific, where the aircraft carrier Iwo Jima was on station. It was a race against time. Now yet another problem. There was an ominous message from Mission Control. Apollo had drifted off course. That could spell disaster when trying to re-enter the Earth's atmosphere.
If you come in too shallow, you skip out like skipping a stone on water. If you come in too steep, you're a fiery meteor for a few brief seconds over the night sky.
The world watched, waited, and prayed.
Lord, your astronauts will come back safe.
If I may be serious for one moment and ask the entire audience for a moment of prayer for the crewmen of the Apollo 13. We'll hold silence for a moment, please.
Houston had a solution, a procedure that had been developed and scrapped after Apollo 8 because the systems and backups were thought reliable enough. The astronauts would have to fire the engine on the LEM for exactly 14 seconds while maneuvering the spacecraft into position for re-entry.
Proper time, I said, Jack, I said, you know, the clock is not running. You've got a wristwatch. You time the burn. I said, Fred, I know that when the engine goes on full blast, because there wasn't any throttle up or anything like that, no autopilot, I said, I don't think I'll be able to keep the Earth in the window on all 3 axes. You take the backup hand controller, and you keep the Earth from going back and forth too much. I'll take the prime and keep it from going up and down too much. I had 2 buttons over in the side of my console. One said start, and one said stop. These were the emergency electrical connections from the battery to the descent engine. I think the only time they were ever used in the program. At the proper time, Jack said start. I hit the start button. The engine went on full blast. I jockeyed the Earth vertically. Fred jockeyed it horizontally. 14 seconds later, Jack said stop, and we stopped. And then we waited to see if we'd gotten back in that corridor, and of course the ground was tracking us.
Friday, April 17th. Showing signs of fatigue, stress, the astronauts prepared for re-entry. 5 hours before splashdown, 35,000 miles from Earth, the service module was jettisoned.
And there's one whole side of that spacecraft missing. Is that right? The whole panel is blown out, almost from the base to the engine. Really a mess. Man, that's unbelievable.
10,000 miles up, an hour before splashdown, the entire crew moved back into the command module, Odyssey, and set the LEM free.
Let's get it. Okay, copy that. Farewell, Aquarius. We thank you.
This is Apollo Control. Apollo 13, the age of Aquarius ended at 141 hours, 30 minutes, ground elapsed time.
Apollo 13 was back on track. 3 astronauts huddled in just the command module, Odyssey, using oxygen and electrical systems specifically designed for re-entering the Earth's atmosphere. Not since the explosion 55 hours into the flight had the mission been running according to plan. At 40,000 feet, the 3 main parachutes popped out, slowing the module down from 20,000 miles an hour to about 20 miles an hour.
Odyssey, Houston, we show you on the mains. It really looks great.
Odyssey splashed down just a mile or so from the Iwo Jima, making it one of the most accurate water landings on record.
Like huge birds. They certainly were remarkably calm in the face of such disaster.
I was thrilled about it. Biggest thrill in my life.
When we were coming home on Apollo 8, and we had looked back on the Earth, and we had mentioned then that the Earth was really the only place we had to go to. It was the only place that had color. It was the only place that we could see in the universe that had life, that had warmth, that was home to us. On Apollo 13, on the way home, the situation was a little different. and I wondered just when and how we would get back. But I think the secret was the fact that we have in America something which has always been part of us, and that's teamwork. Just as Fred and Jack and I try to work as a team up there, we had hundreds of people on the ground that really saw to it that we got back home safely.
Apollo 13's troubles were to bring a 9-month delay in the space program. Changes were made in the service module, most notably adding a third oxygen tank located far from the other two. Diminished public interest and growing political hostility saw the number of remaining lunar landings cut from 6 to 4. Apollo 13 was the last real space adventure. They risked their lives, they relied on their wits, the true brotherhood of the right stuff. Thanks for joining us on Disaster Chronicles. I'm Joe Witte.